RealAgriculture Soybean School is brought to you by Basic Seeds and Lallemand Plant Care.
We're talking tissue sampling optimization on this episode of the Soybean School. I'm Kelvin Hepner with RealAgriculture and pleased to be joined by Chase Austvold of Lallemand Plant Care. We're in a soybean field here in southern Manitoba. And Chase, when it comes to tissue sampling, given your role, your experience with Lallemand, where do you see tissue testing providing value and helping farmers with reaching that maximum yield potential, their goals?
Yeah, good morning, Kelvin. I think you touched on a very good point, value, extracting more value, especially in the case of trialing. I work for Lallemand. I coordinate our trialing program across the U.S. and Canada, and one of the things I'm always trying to do is optimize how best I can illustrate how products are working in the field. Yeah, and so I think staging and planning a specific protocol is really important and can be beneficial to farmers on how they can really understand how their inputs are acting on their farm, and also how they're managing their agronomic decisions moving forward. And so we got a couple different timings that we're going to talk about today with respect to when and why and what might be beneficial at each of those stages, and how we can be not only reactive but proactive in a sense, how we're making decisions in the future.
Yeah. Another set of data, I guess, that we can use to make decisions not just at the end of the growing season like our yield monitor, but we can use it to make decisions and potentially react to them in the middle of the growing season.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes the stigma, maybe you could say, is that tissue samples are often a reactive measure, whereas I really feel through what I do at Lallemand, it can be very proactive and very illustrative on what we're doing to maximize our crop yield. So there's definitely a give and take for each of those scenarios, and what I hope to do is kind of give you guys a simple protocol and delineate where you can be proactive, where you can be reactive, and ultimately how you can best and efficiently produce a good crop.
Okay. So the field we're in right now, still early staging in terms of there is something you could potentially do to respond to something in this field proactive, and potentially be proactive if you look at that early tissue sampling timing.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a perfect segue on our first recommended tissue timing. Again, we're V2 to V3 right now in this particular field, but really when I would implement this program, I'd want it somewhere to be between V3 and V5. And what I would want to primarily focus on when we get these results back is looking at your macros, seeing what the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are looking like. We know that nitrogen and potassium are going to be really transient during this time period, but also you can begin to look at the micros, but I'm going to focus more on that in our later suggested timings. But absolutely could take reactive measures, but also, most importantly, when we're thinking about evaluating a trial, this is going to be a great time to see if we're getting that maximum nutrient efficiency support the vegetative growth that's needed to reach maximum yield potential.
This also gives us a clue as to whether our inoculant program has been effective?
Absolutely, especially, I normally say it's V3 to V5, but we're out here today, and as an inoculant rep, it's great to see V2 and V3 beans showing some early nodulation. This is right, that early vegetative timing, again, V3 to V5, is really when we're going to step away from what the seed was providing and begin to work on what we as farmers implemented and put into the ground to see how it's doing. So seeing early nodulation in this field is a great sign to set up for success going into the rest of the summer.
Mm-hmm. We're kind of right at the point in the growing season where the days start getting shorter, where we're at that summer solstice, and of course soybeans being photosensitive will respond and move into reproductive mode, and that leads us into that next staging when we can look at tissue sampling.
Yeah, absolutely. The second one, whenever I'm thinking about these different trials that we're doing, is that early onset of flowering or beginning to flower. Specifically, R1 to R2 would be a great time for that. And that's primarily because when you hit that reproductive stage, we know that we are now at that exponential uplift of nutrient demand, right? We're just starting to get that. We need to be set perfectly with respect to our nutrients across the board to reach maximum yields. And also when it comes to now we're out of the vegetative stage, as soon as we start developing flowers, pods, those are what we would call differentiating tissues. And differentiating tissues is really heavily reliant on your micronutrient availability. So maybe not as key early on to really hone in on that at that first vegetative timing. That's really one you want to pay close attention to your micronutrients at this early set of reproductive, and this is a perfect opportunity to be reactive in that instance as well, making sure that you got sufficient boron. Boron's imperative for enzyme health when it comes to differentiating tissue, and it's just, it's setting the stage for your yield, obviously. And so our second recommended timing is that R1 to R2, and we're going to look at the macros too. We're also going to want to pay particular attention to sulfur. Sulfur is a key nutrient along with iron to support actually rhizobium nitrogen fixation. So that's another thing to take a look on, because we know that nitrogen demand getting in that reproductive stage is really going to ramp up. And two nutrients, nitrogen's the obvious indicator, but that really support that are actually sulfur and iron. So pay close attention to that. We know that our nitrogen demand is coming at that early reproductive stage, but also our micronutrients are imperative for these beans to be able to successfully differentiate tissue.
All right. And then our final window would be as we move into pod fill, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Full pod at the beginning of seed formation. It's the most intensive phase, or nutrient demanding phase, and of course it's just going to set up for that final yield. A little harder to be reactive there in that sense, but giving you a really good idea with these other two timings that I suggested with this third one to give you a really comprehensive picture on what your trial is looking like this, throughout the year. So,
and that's where it helps us with decisions for future growing seasons in terms of comparing different treatments, potentially different side-by-side things that we've done in the field. Potentially, this is where we could learn some of that information, like you said before we get to the yield monitor on the combine.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I focus on in my work is showing how our biological seed treatments are working in the field, and oftentimes there's not huge drastic differences. And we've been able to find out that, with the specific tissue sampling programming, we're able to not only see the benefit throughout the growing season, but it usually correlates to the yield monitor. So it's a great way to do that, have a full rounded package. I think the other thing to note too is, we couldn't live in a more turmoil type environment in the agriculture world where we're dependent on Mother Nature. I've seen it time and time again. We spend a lot of money on setting up these trials and taking the time to monitor it throughout the season. But whether it's a hailstorm, whether it's you got two combines in the field that maybe weren't calibrated correctly, we want to make sure we get good data. And sometimes that just doesn't happen at the end of the season, whether it's Mother Nature or just a mistake. And this allows you to have at least a very solid understanding about how these different trials or inputs are working on your farm throughout the season. And hopefully, again, in an ideal world, we're going to get the combine information as well. But it's really a pretty inexpensive investment to monitor how you're evaluating your inputs on your farm.
All right. Well, speaking of Mother Nature, rain is important for moving this crop along, and it feels like it's starting to come here. So
yeah.
Thanks for making the drive out today, Chase, and sharing your insight with us on tissue sampling.
Yeah, very good, Calvin. Thank you guys very much.